So welcome back to our Parenting Today. We're still on week one. We're on part three now, where we're going to explore various learning theories related to our course. Talking about learning theories, um, the dominant theory for the first half of the century was the theory that was stated that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. It really suggested that we are a product of our environment, which reinforced Dr. Charles Darwin's ideas. And the proponents of this type of behavioral conditioning were termed behaviorists. And the famous behaviorist that we're going to focus on in today's class is Ivan Pavlov, who is the father of classic conditioning. We're also going to talk about James Watson, who is most associated with stimulus generalization, and B.F. Skinner, who was the father of operant conditioning. So I definitely want you to put a circle or a star around this slide, either on paper or in your minds. Write it down, because you're going to see some quiz questions directly relating to the behavioral theorists. And we talk about Pavlov. Everybody remembers, or most people remember, Pavlov's dogs. Perhaps you've learned about this in another course, or this could be the first time that you're learning about it at all, which is perfectly okay. Ivan Pavlov was alive between the years of 1849 until 1936. He was a Russian physiologist, and right around the year 1927, Dr. Pavlov became very interested in the whole concept of reflexes and studying reflexes. He noticed that dogs naturally salivate when they smell food. He also noticed that dogs were fed by men in lab coats, and that dogs drooled every time they saw a lab coat, even in the absence of food. So Pavlov started to do some conditions or experiments rather based on this, trying to set up different conditions to determine what was causing the salivation in the dogs. And what that he noticed is that dogs that were exposed to food would salivate. Dogs that were exposed to food plus a bell would salivate, and dogs that were exposed to the bell over time in the absence of food would salivate. So what I used to do when I first started teaching about classic conditioning and Dr. Pavlov's theory about 14 years ago on the ground in a classroom, when I taught about this particular theory, what I would do is I would bring some country time powdered from concentrate lemonade to class, and I would bring little spoons and some little Dixie cups for each student. And I would fill each Dixie cup up with some of that country time lemonade from concentrate powder and offer one to each student along with a spoon. And I would bring a bell to class. And as I was teaching and lecturing through the evening, I would ring the bell. And at the beginning of class, I would ask the students, please take a spoonful of this country time lemonade and put it into your mouth every single time that you hear the bell ring. So it was typically a 3-hour class that I was teaching. So I'd ring the bell, about maybe 15 to 20 times. And every time I would ding the bell, students would give themselves just a little mouthful of this country time lemonade. And then, about a half hour before the class ended, I'd ask the students to give me all of their country time lemonade, put them in the trash, and then I would ring the bell, after the lemonade was no longer present. And the vast majority of students would report to me having had the experience of tasting that country time lemonade very strongly when I rang that bell, even though they did not put the country time lemonade in their mouths. So it would actually give them a real world sort of a feel of how this classic conditioning actually works. Now, of course, that's not something that I can do now because we're taking this course online, right? I actually stopped doing the particular experiment or class exercise with students just because I had students, they wouldn't want to participate. Of course, I wouldn't force them, and sometimes people would say they would feel sick from actually ingesting all of that powdered from concentrate lemonade. So it's not something that I would necessarily encourage you to do. But again, just wanted to give you you another example of this classical conditioning and what it looks like and how it could work outside of Pavlov's dogs. So this right here is James Watson, pictured on the screen. And James Watson was alive from 1878 until 1958, and he truly began the behaviorism movement. He believed that behavior is more important than internal mental states. He worked at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, and he left in disgrace after an affair with his graduate student became public. We talk about James Watson. One of his most important pieces of work, or most featured, is the little Albert experiment, which can be defined as stimulus generation. And it's a case study of 9-month-old baby Albert, who had no fear upon initial exposure to white rats, rabbits, dogs, monkey, and other stimuli. So he allowed the baby to play with the rat freely, and then he paired touching the rat with loud noise. And so typically, 9-month-old babies are wired to be fearful of loud noise. So when the shown rat with no noise, fear and avoidance persisted. So that was a conditioned type of a response. And then he found that fear, baby Albert, sort of generalized that fear to other furry types of objects. So as I'm explaining this different theory to you, I'm sure that many of you are thinking that maybe today that particular experiment wouldn't be considered ethical, right? And that might not get past a IRB, or what's called an institutional review board hearing. So that's the particular institution that's at most research centers and universities across the country, which are responsible for determining whether research is ethical or not ethical. So the experiment exposed the baby to loud noise, which equaled fear. So that baby was exposed to loud noise, which elicited that fear response, plus a white rat, which resulted in fear. So when the baby was exposed to the white rat alone, that fear persisted. And when the baby was exposed to non-white rabbit, which is a generalized stimulus, alone, 17 days after that conditioned response, it still resulted in that baby having a fear as a generalized response. So that brings us to the question, what would Pavlov and Watson have to say about parenting? So B.F. Skinner, who is considered the grandfather of operant conditioning, says that the consequences of a behavior has an effect on the future consequence of that behavior. There are 4 types of conditioning. The first type is positive reinforcement, and that is behavior that is strengthened by the presence of reward. The second type of conditioning is deemed negative reinforcement, and that is behavior that is strengthened by stopping or avoiding a negative condition. Third type of conditioning is termed punishment, and that's behavior that is weakened by experiencing a negative condition. And the fourth type of behavior is extinction, and that is behavior that is weakened by not experiencing a reward or a negative condition. So I want to draw your attention to this slide. It's very important. You're going to see at least one quiz question related to this. I encourage you to pay particular attention as you're preparing for the quiz to the whole concept of negative reinforcement. And again, negative reinforcement is that behavior that is strengthened by stopping or avoiding a negative condition. So again, right here, this is a nice slide that really helps illustrate this the whole concepts of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment and extinction very nicely. When we talk about operant conditioning, we want to remember that that's based on the assumption that all behavior is learned and can be modified using schedules of reinforcement. So this is the basis for training animals as well as for parenting. So there are 2 schedules of reinforcement. One would be continuous, and the other general type would be partial. So when we talk about continuous reinforcement, that would be one reward for every instance of a behavior. And one of the pros of this type of continuous reinforcement is that it's highly successful at producing a behavior very quickly. One of the cons is that it requires constant attention and it required constant reward or behavior, or it quickly extinguishes. An example of this is training a dog to sit. Another type of reward is partial reinforcement, of which there is 4 types. That first type is fixed ratio, and that's offering a reward after a fixed number of responses. And one of the pro of this fixed type fixed ratio partial reinforcement is that there's a high steady state of responding. A con is that it requires tracking and attention. And another con is it must be maintained or behavior will quickly extinguish. An example is piecework here. Partial reinforcement, the second type is variable ratio, and that's a reward at unpredictable intervals. And one of the pros is it's a high steady state of responding. Behaviors will continue long after the rewards stop. Some cons are that their bad behaviors are difficult to extinguish using this variable ratio, and rewards may not outweigh the costs. An example of this type of reinforcement is slot machines. And again, continuing on with our discussion of partial reinforcement, this time we're going to focus on that fixed interval, and that's a reward on regular time interval. So one of the pros of this is it has a strong response rate near the end of the time interval. A con would be it has a low response rate until just before the reward. Another con would be that the behavior extinguishes rather quickly if the reward stops. So an example of this would be paychecks, in the old days when they would actually be handed out in a group and not, land to your direct deposit via a computer. And another example of this would be feeding animals. The fourth component or type of partial reinforcement that we're going to discuss is variable interval. And that is a reward after unpredictable time interval. And the pros of that is it tends to show a steady response. It does not extinguish quickly. And one of the cons is the rewards are pretty slow and unpredictable. And an example of that is fishing. That's a beautiful example of that particular type of conditioning. And again, it's really important that you focus on those past 4 or 5 slides that we just went over, because you'll definitely see a quiz question related to that. So we're going to end part 3 now. So I invite you to join me, still remaining on week 1. We'll move along into part 4 in our next video. So I look forward to rejoining with you shortly.